The story begins as all great nightmares do, with a transmission. The Aspera, a deep space salvage vessel, drifted through the uncharted expanse of Sector 93R. The crew was used to long silences. They had spent the last 3 months hunting for derelict vessels or mining platforms lost to the abyss. But on the 104th day of their expedition, the silence broke. The transmission wasn't a voice, nor was it any recognizable signal. It was a low-frequency hum that vibrated deep in the bones, like a sound that existed just beneath the threshold of hearing. It came from a cluster of drifting vessels that their scanners had failed to register until now. A fleet of massive warships, ancient and alien, suspended like tombstones in the black. The salvage crew was not one to ignore opportunity. Warships meant technology, and technology meant credits. Yet there was something unsettling about how the ships floated, perfectly still, their hulls intact but lifeless. The Aspera's captain, Rena Solis, stared at the fleet on the screen, her brow furrowed. "These ships, they don't match any design in the database," Rena murmured. Her voice carried an edge of unease. "They're big," said Doran Voss, the ship's mechanic. "Bigger than anything we've seen before. Those things could swallow a battleship." The Aspera approached cautiously, its floodlights illuminating the fleet's jagged, obsidian hulls. The ships looked alive in some uncanny way, their surfaces sleek and black, absorbing the light like void stone. Strange glyphs ran along their sides, glowing faintly with an eerie green bioluminescence. The glyphs twisted and shifted as though they were alive, their patterns changing when observed too long. "It's beautiful," whispered Lyra, the ship's linguist and historian. She had a knack for recognizing the unknown, but even her awe was tinged with dread. "Whatever these ships are, they're old. Pre-human, maybe, pre-everything." Rena ordered the Aspera to dock with the largest vessel in the fleet, a monstrous dreadnought the size of a small moon. Its hangar doors yawned open like a mouth, inviting them in. The ship had no identifying marks, no flag, no insignia. Nothing to indicate who had built it or why it was abandoned. The first thing the crew noticed was the silence. The hangar bay was enormous, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into shadows. It was devoid of life, but not of presence. The air, if it could even be called air, was heavy, clinging to their skin through their suits. There was no sound except the faint hum of the ship's systems, still miraculously operational after what must have been centuries. "Radiation levels are low," Doran reported, scanning the area with his handheld device. "Atmosphere's breathable. Barely. But I wouldn't take my helmet off just yet." Lyra ran her fingers along the walls, feeling the strange glyphs carved into the metal. They pulsed faintly under her touch, as though alive. "This language, it's like nothing I've ever seen. It's not just writing. It's something else." "What do you mean, something else?" Rena asked, her voice tight. "It's layered, like it's speaking to you but not with words. It's in my head," Lyra said, her voice trailing off. She quickly pulled her hand away, as though the ship had burned her. The deeper they went, the worse it got. The corridors were labyrinthine, winding and looping back on themselves in ways that defied logic. The walls seemed to shift when they weren't looking, leading them down paths they hadn't taken. The air grew colder the farther they went, and the shadows were wrong. At first, they thought it was just their minds playing tricks on them, the stress of exploring an alien ship in the middle of nowhere. But the shadows moved. They slid along the walls, separate from the light sources. Sometimes they lingered at the edges of their vision, humanoid shapes with no features, watching. It wasn't until they reached the ship's command center that they realized the true horror of what they'd found. The command center was vast, a cathedral of alien technology. Consoles blinked with unreadable symbols, and a massive viewport overlooked the rest of the fleet. But it wasn't the technology that drew their attention. It was the bodies. Hundreds of figures sat at their stations, their backs to the crew. They were humanoid but not human, their skeletal frames encased in armor that had fused with their flesh. Their heads hung low, and their hands were locked to their controls. At first, the crew thought they were dead. But then one of them moved. Lyra screamed. The figure turned its head slowly, its face an eyeless void. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out. Instead, the crew heard it in their minds. A whispering, static-filled voice that spoke in fragments. Remember, our shadows, lost, forgotten, Armada. The lights in the room flickered, and the bodies at the consoles began to twitch. One by one, they turned their heads toward the crew, their eyeless faces staring. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of broken voices echoing in their minds. Rena grabbed Lyra by the arm and pulled her back. We're leaving, now. But the ship had other plans. The doors slammed shut, sealing them inside. The glyphs on the walls pulsed brighter, their light searing into the crew's eyes. The shadows on the walls began to stretch and grow, peeling away from the surfaces and coalescing into humanoid forms. They moved jerkily, as though struggling to maintain their shape. Doran fired his plasma cutter at one of the shadows. The bolt passed through it, striking the wall behind. The shadow didn't flinch. We're trapped, Doran shouted, his voice tinged with panic. The whispering in their heads grew louder, becoming a deafening roar. The crew clutched their helmets, trying to block it out, but it was inside them now, burrowing into their minds. Memories surfaced unbidden. Painful, intimate moments from their pasts. The shadows fed on them, growing larger with each memory they consumed. Rena fought to stay focused, her mind racing. We have to shut it down. Whatever's causing this, it's in the ship. We need to find it and destroy it. The crew staggered out of the command center, the shadows following close behind. The corridors twisted and warped around them, leading them deeper into the ship. The whispers became voices, distinct and familiar. They heard loved ones, long dead, calling their names. They heard their own voices, pleading and screaming. By the time they reached the heart of the ship, they were already beginning to forget who they were. The heart of the dreadnought was nothing like the rest of the ship. The walls here pulsed with an unnatural light, and the air thrummed with an energy that seemed to resonate deep in their bones. The glyphs had grown more erratic, sprawling across every surface like a virus. They flickered, glowing brighter as the crew entered, as if the ship was aware of their presence. Rena led the way, her hand gripping the hilt of her plasma blade. Behind her, Doran carried the group's portable generator, a heavy, clunky device they used to power through salvage jobs in derelict vessels. Lyra followed last, her gaze darting nervously at the walls, her breathing uneven. The shadows were everywhere now. They pooled in the corners of the room, shifting like black smoke. Occasionally, they took shape, distorted imitations of humanoid figures that stood motionless, staring with empty voids where their faces should have been. Lyra broke the silence, her voice shaky. It's not just a weapon, it's alive. The ship, the shadows, it's all one organism. Rena didn't turn around. Her focus was locked on the massive object in the center of the room. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. A pulsating, black obelisk rose from the floor, its surface covered in the same shifting glyphs that coated the walls. The obelisk was partially embedded in the floor, like a jagged piece of glass driven into flesh. It was the source of the hum that had first lured them here, a sound that was no longer beneath hearing but loud and oppressive, vibrating in their skulls. Doran squinted at it. What the hell is that thing? A reactor? A core? It's not mechanical, Lyra murmured. It's something else entirely. It's psychic. She trailed off, staring at the obelisk with a mix of fear and fascination. That's why the shadows are here. They're fragments of the crew or whatever these ships used to be. This thing broke them apart. It's not just a weapon. It erases identity, memory. It eats you. As she spoke, one of the shadows moved closer, its shape becoming more defined. It was humanoid but elongated, its arms unnaturally long and thin. It raised a hand, almost as if reaching out to Lyra. She gasped and stumbled backward. Stay away from it, Rena barked, stepping between Lyra and the shadow. She swung her plasma blade in a wide arc, but the shadow didn't retreat. It simply dissolved into smoke, then reformed a few feet away, its featureless face still locked on Lyra. The whispers were growing louder again. This time, they weren't fragments of alien voices but clear and distinct, voices the crew recognized. Doran froze, his eyes wide. "That's my mother," he whispered. His voice cracked, and he stepped toward the obelisk, dropping the generator with a loud clang. Rena grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "It's not real, Doran. None of this is real." But he was already shaking her off, tears streaming down his face. "No, you don't understand. I can hear her. She's here. She's calling me." Before Rena could stop him, Doran staggered toward the obelisk. The shadows swarmed around him, their forms twisting and writhing. They didn't attack, they didn't need to. The closer he got, the more he began to change. His steps grew unsteady, and his body seemed to flicker, as if he were a poorly rendered hologram. His face twisted in confusion and fear as the shadows latched onto him, sinking into his skin like ink. "I can't remember," he muttered, his voice breaking. "Who am I? Why am I here?" His body convulsed, and then he collapsed to the floor, his features already beginning to blur. His form became translucent, his flesh dissolving into smoke. Within moments, he was gone, leaving behind only a faint shadow etched onto the floor. Lyra screamed, covering her face with her hands. Rena stood frozen, her mind racing. She had lost crew members before, but never like this. Never to something she couldn't fight. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, clawing at the edges of her sanity. She could hear her father's voice, stern and commanding, telling her she wasn't strong enough to lead. She could hear the voice of her first love, laughing at her failures. And beneath it all, she could hear herself, whispering doubts she hadn't dared to voice in years. She shook her head violently, trying to drown out the noise. "Lyra, focus!" she snapped, her voice cutting through the chaos. Lyra lowered her hands, tears streaming down her face. She was shaking but nodded. "We have to destroy it," she whispered. Rena pointed at the obelisk. "That thing is the core. If we take it out, maybe we can stop this. Can you figure out a way to overload it?" Lyra stared at the obelisk, her mind working through the haze of fear. "If it's psychic, it's feeding on us. Our memories, our identities. Maybe if we overload it with input, it'll collapse under the strain." "How do we do that?" "We use the generator," Lyra said, glancing at the device Doran had dropped. "It's designed to interface with different systems. If I can rig it to send a constant stream of data, images, sounds, everything, it might disrupt the obelisk's connection to us." Rena nodded, gripping her plasma blade tighter. "Do it. I'll keep the shadows off you." Lyra hesitated, glancing at the spot where Doran had disappeared. "Rena, what if?" "Don't think about it." Rena cut her off. Her voice was hard, but there was a flicker of desperation in her eyes. "Just do it, Lyra." Lyra nodded and hurried to the generator. She worked quickly, her hands shaking as she rewired the device. The shadows began to close in, their forms growing more solid with each step. Rena stood between them and Lyra, swinging her blade in wide arcs. It didn't stop them, but it kept them at bay for now. The whispers became deafening, drilling into Rena's mind. She could feel her grip on herself slipping. Memories flickered and faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of loss. She saw her mother's face, her brother's laugh, the first ship she'd ever captained, all of it unraveling like thread. "Lyra!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Almost there." Lyra yelled back. The generator sparked to life, sending out a burst of static that echoed through the chamber. The shadows recoiled, their forms flickering. Lyra keyed in the final commands, and the generator began to hum, its interface glowing as it flooded the obelisk with raw data. Images, voices, fragments of human experience. The obelisk pulsed violently, its glyphs flaring brighter than ever. The hum grew into a high-pitched whine, and the room began to shake. "It's working," Lyra shouted. But the shadows weren't done. They surged toward the generator, a tidal wave of black smoke and distorted forms. Rena threw herself in their path, swinging her blade wildly. She knew it was hopeless, but she didn't care. "Come on, you bastards," she snarled. The obelisk let out a deafening roar, a sound that wasn't sound at all but a psychic scream that tore through their minds. Rena fell to her knees, clutching her head. Lyra collapsed beside her, the generator sparking violently as it overloaded. The last thing Rena saw before the darkness consumed her was the obelisk shattering, its shards dissolving into light. Rena awoke to silence. Not the oppressive hum of the obelisk, not the whispers of shadows clawing at her mind, just silence. Her body felt heavy, as if gravity itself had doubled, and her head throbbed with a dull ache. She blinked several times, her vision swimming. Slowly, the world came into focus. Dim, flickering lights, walls streaked with black residue. The shattered remains of the obelisk scattered across the floor like shards of obsidian glass. "Lyra," Rena croaked, her voice dry and raspy. A faint groan answered her. Turning her head, she saw Lyra slumped against the far wall, her breathing shallow but steady. The portable generator lay in a smoldering heap nearby, its casing warped and blackened from the overload. Rena forced herself to her feet, every muscle protesting. She stumbled toward Lyra and dropped to one knee, shaking her shoulder. "Lyra, wake up." Lyra's eyes fluttered open, dazed and unfocused. "Rena," she whispered. "You're alive?" Rena said, relief washing over her like a wave. "We did it. The obelisk." Lyra sat up abruptly, her eyes wide with panic. "The shadows, where are they?" Rena froze and scanned the room. The shadows were gone, or at least they seemed to be. The walls, once alive with pulsing glyphs, were now lifeless and inert. The oppressive presence that had weighed on them since they'd boarded the ship was nowhere to be felt. "They're gone," Rena said, though her voice lacked conviction. "At least, I think they are." Lyra didn't seem reassured. She looked around nervously, her hands trembling. "We have to get out of here, right now." Rena couldn't have agreed more. The journey back to the Aspera was like traversing a battlefield after the fighting had stopped. The once labyrinthine corridors of the ship were now eerily still, their twisting, shifting architecture frozen in place. The bodies of the alien crew remained seated at their stations, but now they were crumbling to dust, their skeletal forms disintegrating as if time had finally caught up with them. The ship itself seemed to be dying. The faint hum of its systems was fading, replaced by an unsettling creak, like the groan of a predator breathing its last. Rena and Lyra moved quickly, their boots clanging against the metallic floor. Neither of them spoke. There was no need to. Every step brought them closer to safety, or so they hoped. When they reached the hangar bay, they found the Aspera right where they'd left it, its floodlights casting long shadows across the cavernous space. Rena felt a surge of relief as she saw the ship's familiar outline. "Come on," she said, quickening her pace. But as they approached, Lyra stopped abruptly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "What is it?" Rena asked, turning back. Lyra pointed. "That wasn't there before." Rena followed her gaze and felt her stomach drop. There, etched into the floor in blackened streaks, was a massive glyph, similar to the ones that had adorned the walls of the dreadnought. It pulsed faintly, as though it still held a trace of the ship's malevolent energy. "It's a mark," Lyra whispered, her voice trembling. "Scar. We didn't destroy it, Rena. We only disrupted it. Still here, waiting." Rena's jaw tightened. She wasn't sure if it was fear or anger driving her now, but she knew one thing for certain. They had to leave. "Let's go," she said firmly, grabbing Lyra by the arm and pulling her toward the Aspera. The air grew colder as they boarded the salvage vessel, the sensation prickling against their skin even through their suits. Rena sealed the hatch behind them, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to breathe. "We made it," she said, though the words felt hollow. Lyra nodded weakly but didn't reply. The Aspera powered up without issue, its engines humming to life as Rena and Lyra strapped themselves into the cockpit. The vast, empty expanse of space stretched out before them, the other ships of the Forgotten Armada still drifting silently in the void. Rena set a course back to their nearest station, her fingers flying over the controls. She had no intention of sticking around, but as the Aspera began to pull away, Lyra gasped. "Rena, look." Rena glanced at the viewport, and her heart sank. The dreadnought's shattered obelisk was reforming. The shards of black glass that had scattered across the chamber were now floating back together, drawn by an unseen force. The glyphs along the ship's hull began to glow once more, brighter and more violent than before. "It's rebuilding itself," Lyra said, her voice a mix of awe and terror. Rena slammed her hand against the controls, pushing the engines to their limit. "We're not sticking around to find out what happens next." The Aspera surged forward, leaving the dreadnought and its cursed fleet behind. The shadows of the warships grew smaller and smaller until they were nothing more than specks in the distance. But even as they sped away, Rena couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't truly free. Hours passed. The Aspera drifted through the void, its crew silent and exhausted. Rena sat in the cockpit, her eyes fixed on the endless stars outside. Lyra had retreated to her quarters, claiming she needed to rest, though Rena suspected she simply didn't want to talk. For a moment, Rena allowed herself to relax. She leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and exhaled. That's when she heard it. A whisper, faint, almost imperceptible. "Remember, US." Her eyes snapped open, and she looked around the cockpit, her pulse racing. There was nothing there, just the quiet hum of the Aspera's systems. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it. "It's just your imagination," she muttered. But the whisper came again, louder this time. "Forgotten Armada." Rena's blood ran cold. She turned to look at the viewport, and her breath caught in her throat. The reflection staring back at her wasn't her own. It was a shadow. Days later, the Aspera was found drifting on the edge of Sector 93R. The salvage vessel appeared intact, its systems operational. But there was no sign of the crew. The ship's logs were corrupted, overwritten by fragments of static-filled transmissions. But one phrase repeated over and over again in a dozen different voices, etched into the databanks like a scar. "We are the shadows. We are the Forgotten Armada." No one knows what became of Captain Rena Solis and her crew. Some say they were claimed by the Armada, their identities erased, their souls consumed. Others believe they became part of the shadows, doomed to drift through the void for eternity. The fleet remains where it was found, a graveyard of ancient warships waiting in the dark. And those who venture too close to it often report hearing whispers, a chorus of voices calling out from the emptiness. They say the Armada is still alive, and it remembers,